All right, welcome everyone to a lovely Thursday afternoon. And today we're extremely grateful to have three of our graduate students presenting in our Brown Bag series. Andrea Miller, as you know, is an MSc student in the program. She's going to be presenting about building futures Indigenous-owned renewable energy in Alberta and a just transition. Sonak Patel, also one of our fabulous MSc students, will be presenting on renewable energy as well, empowering our communities, how municipal governments can play a role in Alberta's energy transition. Monique Holowach is also going to be presenting about climate denial and wind energy development in rural Alberta. So as you can tell, the theme this week is renewable energy, and it's a great opportunity for our graduate students to showcase their work together. And I'm very grateful for the turnout. I'm joining you today from Treaty 7 territory in southern Alberta, and really looking forward to the opportunity where we can all be face-to-face in Edmonton at some point and able to share a seminar series discussion at some point in person. However, I think the Zoom format is working quite well for a lot of people. And with that, I see that Sonak will be going first. And so Sonak, did you want to go ahead? I should say that each of the students will be presenting for 10 minutes, and then we'll probably hold questions till the end unless you have burning questions. Is that the best format, John?
Yeah, actually, I'll start with a couple of comments and then we'll hand it over to Sonak.
Okay, I'll take it away, John.
Okay, thanks, Brenda. So thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. We thought we would try this slightly different format for the seminar with three grad student presentations that are all linked to our broader project work around energy transition within Alberta and looking at those issues from different perspectives. So just to set the stage and kind of get people thinking in this space, I thought I'd share with you just a couple of ideas that come from some work that I've done with a colleague, Kate Sharon, at Dalhousie University. And so this is an edited collection, and we have a chapter in this book called A Critical Approach to the Social Acceptance of Renewable Energy Infrastructures. And this book is an attempt to try and kind of dig deeper into what we mean by social acceptance. Like when people say that the public accepts a project or this project is socially acceptable, what does that really mean? How do we understand that as researchers? How do we study it, and how do we measure it potentially in different ways? And so with my colleague, Kate Sharon, we developed a chapter for this book collection called Strategies for Integrating Quantitative Methods into Critical Social Acceptance Research. And we recognize that there's a lot of good quantitative research on this topic that uses sophisticated methods, but we also note that a lot of the social acceptance research that is more quantitative in nature is also quite descriptive and not very sophisticated and really needs some further attention. And so one of the things that we do in this chapter is to try to emphasize 2 points in particular. One point is that we think using quantitative methods, we can take a more critical approach to this question of social acceptance. What does it really mean? If we go beyond just focusing on the individual, so beyond methodological individualism. And that's where we try to situate our work within a community context. So obviously individuals have perspectives and opinions, but they're also shaped by and influenced by the people around them, right? So we want to really take seriously this kind of relational aspect, as well as this idea of norms and how they can play a role in shaping people's understanding of projects and whether those projects are deemed to be acceptable or not. The other thing we do in our quantitative methods is to try and move beyond just straightforward Likert type questions. So on a scale of 1 to 5, do you agree or disagree with a particular statement? That's a very common approach to measuring social acceptance. But we also recognize that these methods can also include trying to force trade-offs. So some of the research we've done over the past has used methods like Q methodology that explicitly forces trade-offs between statements. So you can't have everything, you have to choose. And that gives us some additional insights. We also try to use things like vignettes and scenarios within our survey research. And Monique will talk more about some of that vignette research that we've done recently in Alberta. And then lastly, we try to look at things beyond opinions or attitudes into content like emotions, how things feel, because we know in sociology that emotions are very compelling. They're actually very motivating for people. And we often kind of neglect looking at the role of emotions in people's behavior and actions. And so we try to bring that into our research as well. So all of that is to say that our research efforts are really trying to find ways of understanding how residents will respond to new projects. And those responses can be very positive, negative, or they can be very complicated in terms of these responses that are rooted in, histories of relationships with governments, relationships with industries, attachments or connections to the land that matter to people. And so our work is really trying to seek to situate these local points of view, these individual points of view within a community context, to try and build an understanding of support or opposition to energy projects, but also to try and link energy development with community development in a more explicit way. So those are some of the broader objectives that our research group's trying to achieve, the methods we try to use in our work. And from there, I think I'll hand it off to Sonak, who can lead off the first presentation to get into some of the details on his study. So Sonak, I think I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thank you, John. Can everyone see the slides okay?
Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, yeah. Thank you, Brenda and John, for the introductions. Before I get into my research, I just want to acknowledge that my research is being done on Treaty 6 lands, traditional and present territory of many Indigenous and First Peoples that continue to live and gather here. So getting into my work, like John mentioned, our team is looking at understanding the social conditions that are enabling and constraining renewable development in Alberta. And specifically, I'm looking at the role that municipal governments can play within that. But before I get into that, let's just start by getting a little lay of the land of the energy landscape here in Alberta. Alberta's electricity generation is predominantly powered by fossil fuels, mostly natural gas. And while coal is intended to be phased out, the Alberta Energy System Operator predicts this capacity will mostly be replaced by natural gas. So this kind of energy system creates several issues. And one of the big ones is greenhouse gases. Electricity generation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Alberta. And there's also issues of fairness, where some communities are affected by nearby energy infrastructure that powers communities across the province. These communities can be impacted by things like air and noise pollution, visual intrusions, and wildlife and health impacts, and all of that without seeing much benefit from these nearby power plants. So while renewable energy can help address the carbon intensity of the electricity system, there are definitely physical and technical constraints to renewable adoption, but there are also steep political and social constraints to renewable development as well. So in Alberta, public discourse about energy issues can be very divisive, as I'm sure many of us have experience with. Renewable projects can receive some opposition from local communities, and as we've seen many times in Canada, this can result in projects being canceled and governments being dissuaded from supporting renewable development. Sometimes these community concerns are unfairly disregarded under the term NIMBYism, But if we want to encourage renewable development needed as part of our climate action efforts, we need to start understanding the reception to these projects and find ways to develop them with the support of the people most affected by them. And this often means incorporating greater aspects of fairness into renewable project design. One concept that has emerged in energy social science is community energy. Community energy literature seeks to intersect energy transition efforts with concepts of justice and energy democracy. And while community energy has been defined many ways by several authors, across the majority of the literature reviewed, two dimensions are almost always included, and we've displayed those in this graph here. On the x-axis, you can see community benefits, also called distributive justice, which describes the fairness of the distribution of benefits and impacts. So because the impacts of energy infrastructure are largely local, distributive justice occurs when the benefits of the energy project also remain local. On the y-axis, community participation and engagement is also often referred to as procedural justice. This means that local people have a meaningful and influential say in the design and development of energy projects. So by integrating community values into energy projects, community energy has had a demonstrated ability to foster community and social support for energy development, and could play a role in addressing socio-political barriers to renewable development. So a lot of our research, as I'm sure my colleagues will get into, examines the potential for community institutions to play a role in the Alberta energy transition. In my work, community energy literature has highlighted several possible roles for municipal or local governments to play. Municipalities do represent relatively local populations and areas, allowing project benefits and impacts to remain local. In Alberta, municipalities are also absolutely on the forefront of community engagement among governments, employing tools like open houses, workshops, surveys, and being required to allow any citizens to speak on an issue before council. And renewable energy can provide many benefits to municipalities, including cost savings, revenue generation, greenhouse gas reductions, and energy resilience. Municipalities have many advantages to renewable development compared to other communities, including existing organizational structures and decision-making pathways and access to funding. So this takes me to my research question. I'm looking at understanding the opportunities for municipalities to play a role in renewable development and how municipal decision makers perceive the benefits and challenges to taking on these roles in renewable development. These results are understood using both the theory of planned behavior and transition theory. So moving into the methods, I'm using a mixed methods approach. The first phase is an analysis of a survey administered to municipal decision makers across the province. Received 101 complete responses from 74 unique municipalities. The second phase takes a more detailed look at specific actions and motivations, opportunities, and barriers behind them. This phase involves a case study of renewable development efforts right here in Edmonton. The methods involve a document analysis of renewable energy plans and policies, and semi-structured interviews with city employees, council members, as well as energy experts and institutional stakeholders. So I'll start by talking about the survey results. We asked a lot of questions about renewable perceptions and existing and possible renewable projects. About 30% of respondents said they have existing renewable energy projects, and just under half of the respondents stated interest in developing renewable projects in the near future. So this indicates there is substantial interest and potential for municipal renewable energy projects in Alberta. Of the respondents interested in renewable development, we asked why. And I just want to highlight that the strongest motivations at the top are largely economic, including lowering costs, accessing external supports, which are usually grants, and fostering an innovative image, which respondents felt could attract new people and businesses. We then asked all the respondents to rank their barriers to renewable development, organized into the categories of economic, environmental, technical, and planning. So on the economic side, the highest ranked barriers are steep upfront costs, and related to that, the length of time until a project pays off the initial investment. On the technical side, many respondents feel like renewable projects are too risky and question their feasibility. And I just wanted to point out that surprisingly, concerns about impact to local people and wildlife and the nearby environment are actually among the lowest ranked barriers, despite these being concerns that are often mentioned in renewable energy discourse. And this may be because of the technologies and the scale of projects that municipal respondents are interested in. And then finally, in the planning dimension, the highest ranked barriers are the other priorities that demand municipal resources, and as we saw in the motivations for renewable development, the difficulty of being able to capitalize on these external grants and supports can greatly influence or encourage renewable development or not. So to understand what factors are influencing the intention to develop renewable projects, we created 2 binary regression models. The first model helps us understand who is interested in renewable development. And so it contains several variables measuring the characteristics of both the municipality and the respondents. And the model shows more populous municipalities are more interested in renewable development. And we see cities in particular are strongly correlated with renewable intention. We also asked respondents if their municipality was interested in any capital investment at the time. Respondents who answered yes, even if they didn't rank electricity generation as a priority, were much more likely to say they're interested in renewable development. And the second model aims to understand why some municipal decision makers are interested in renewable development and others are not. Only 2 variables emerged as significant in this analysis. So only a few respondents considered renewable energy infrastructure, diminishing their vista as a major barrier. The higher this barrier was ranked, the less likely the respondent would express interest in renewable development. So we can read that as visual intrusions are not a common barrier, but potentially a deal breaker for those who are concerned about it. And then interestingly, the respondents that considered external barriers, like a lack of support from other orders of government, as higher than their internal barriers, were more likely to be interested in renewable development. This could suggest that intention emerges with the perception of sufficient capacity and willingness within the community. And so their biggest challenges are from beyond the municipality. Moving on to the qualitative phase, the case study. I had 18 semi-structured interviews, most of which were from the city of Edmonton. And these are in the process of being analyzed and synthesized. So I only have a couple of preliminary things to share. So I just want to talk about renewable intention and motivation in Edmonton. So in Edmonton, the question is not whether the city should support renewable energy, but how and where. Everyone I spoke to said the city should have some role in developing renewable energy, but they differed in what the best role should be. So there's 3 fairly distinct roles that I organized these into. One is an ownership developer role, which involves microgeneration projects on city infrastructure, which almost every respondent was in favor of, but there is some contention about the city taking on bigger utility scale projects. There's a purchaser role where the city is in the process of drafting a power purchase agreement with a renewable provider, which encourages renewable development by creating demand, but fails to meet any of the community energy characteristics. And then an enabler role, which just sort of involves removing the red tape and encouraging citizens and businesses to take on renewable development. And I also want to say that these roles were not distinct, and many respondents talked about the need to take on many particular roles. On the motivation side, in somewhat contrast to what we saw in the survey, GHG reduction was the most universally mentioned role and motivation for energy transition. Many talked about the need for Edmonton to take a responsibility to reduce emissions and the economic and other threats of the climate crisis. Economic value primarily comes from local development, with microgen and local projects providing a return on investment, as well as other economic benefits like local expertise and diversifying our energy economy. There's also a number of social and resilience opportunities that were discussed as well. But the big takeaway from this part of the interviews is that ownership and developer roles provide a lot of co-benefits from the city, from economic to social to resilience benefits, but they require a lot of expertise and capital, whereas purchasing and enabling roles are a lot easier, but are purely greenhouse gas reduction efforts and don't meet the qualifications of community energy in the way that I'm going about describing it. So the next steps are just to continue to work with that survey data, integrate that with my document analysis, and then to run a comparison and contrast those results with what we found in the survey. And I've already noted some interesting differences that bear further investigation. So thank you very much for the time. I know I went through that very quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'll hand it over to Andrea to talk about her work. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for those introductions. It's really nice to see you all. Hope everyone has been keeping well. My name's Andrea Miller. I'm a graduate student here in the Department of REES. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory, and I am going to be speaking about a part of my thesis research on Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects in Alberta and our research partnership with Enoch Cree Nation. So as we just heard from Sonak, we know that an energy transition is urgently needed, but right now, I think this transition is mirroring the current centralized and fossil fuel-based energy system where renewable energy infrastructure is predominantly owned and operated by private companies and provincial utilities. Communities are often disconnected from critical energy decision-making. And this also means that projects often do not reflect local priorities or deliver on local benefits. And so an energy transition that does not center justice and equity is going to perpetuate this type of system. And so a just transition as a framework has its roots in labor movements, and it means equal opportunity for communities at all scales to participate in the post-carbon economy and society. And it also means that there's equitable opportunities for communities to see the benefits and the opportunities that are going to be created by this energy transition and this coming clean energy economy. And so we can see this through inclusion in project design and decision-making, or through communities leading their own projects that reflect community priorities. And in Canada, a just transition is one that is centered around Indigenous rights. Just transition upholds the commitments and the relationships that were made in the treaties, and it is also aligned with these frameworks that we see here, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So through Indigenous-led and owned energy projects and other clean energy initiatives, Indigenous communities are leading their own energy transitions and exercising their right to lead the decision-making about development in their lands and territories. So a growing number of Indigenous communities are motivated to pursue renewables for a variety of reasons, to advance this just energy transition that supports future generations, to encourage place-based community and economic development opportunities, to demonstrate climate leadership, and to build an energy system that aligns with Indigenous worldviews. So you may be familiar with some of these energy projects here in Alberta, and each of these represent a unique project type, a unique ownership model, and they also come with their own distinct motivations and challenges. So my research is exploring the role of Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects in Alberta and in the energy transition. This research has taken a multi-phased approach. So I've done stakeholder interviews with key informants who are leaders in Indigenous renewable energy from BC, Alberta, and Ontario. But what I'll be sharing today are some findings from a case study and a research partnership around energy transitions in Enoch Cree Nation in Treaty 6 and just west of the city of Edmonton here. So I've developed this research partnership with community advisors and my community research partner. And with their support and guidance, we have conducted interviews with community members who represent counselors, community leaders, and also representatives from the Enoch Youth Council. So we're starting to develop an understanding of how these Enoch Cree Nation leaders imagine community level energy transitions within the nation and how they envision the role for Enoch and for Indigenous communities more generally in the province's coming clean energy economy. So for this counselor, the need for Indigenous-led transitions is really inseparable from the ways in which current extractive industries have and continue to operate with little consideration for Indigenous rights to lands and territories. This is an experience that Indigenous communities have witnessed from the Trans Mountain Pipeline to CGL to Standing Rock. Projects that are community-led and owned really are offering an alternative to these kinds of projects that are owned by private companies, often headquartered far from impacted communities, who often only offer short-term or token benefits, and who themselves are benefiting from the extraction of resources that were never surrendered by Indigenous communities. Indigenous-led transitions center community contributions and knowledges in project design and decision-making. For this community leader, these projects can be more holistic in their considerations for community-specific knowledge of place, traditional land uses and considerations for project location, and allowances for time taken to begin to build and rebuild these sort of respectful relationships between industry and community. And this counselor acknowledges that Indigenous communities have not always been the beneficiaries of the conventional energy sector. And as much as the energy transition represents a shift in energy generation, it also represents a transition of economy. And so there's really an opportunity for Indigenous communities, an energy opportunity as well as an economic opportunity to sort of be the beneficiaries in this new climate-oriented economy. So how are community-level energy transitions taking place in Enoch Cree Nation? Enoch has initiated a number of clean energy transitions that are in varying stages of development. The nation completed their community energy plan, conducted an energy audit of core nation buildings, and has implemented a number of energy efficiency measures. The nation also recently completed their new water facility that includes a pump house, a water line, and water reservoir, and this facility is retrofitted with a solar field. So in Enoch, these transitions that I mentioned are really a reflection of community-defined priorities. One of the primary motivations for these initiatives has been the priorities expressed by the nation's youth. The nation has an active youth council that is engaged on environmental issues, and young people from across the community are calling on leadership and calling on the community to take action on climate change. Conversations about climate change and renewable energy in the community are also creating these opportunities for intergenerational learning to take place between elders and youth about culturally and ecologically significant environments within the community that will need to be protected for future generations. And this is also evidence of what one participant referred to as one of the nation's greatest strengths, which is this participatory decision-making process and mechanisms like the Youth Council, which really prioritize the perspectives of young people in the community. And in Enoch, these transitions have been 100% community-led. So nation members are included in decisions around what types of development occur in the community, where development can happen, and which areas should remain free from development. So this participation in project design, I think, creates a sense of ownership over these projects, and it also ensures that the projects are true representations of community values and goals. Perhaps a more sort of intangible outcome of these kinds of initiatives that I'll share with you is this overarching sense of community pride. So a project like the solar field on the water facility represents a successful outcome of the community's engagement and decision-making process. And it also represents a tangible step in taking action and in addressing the concerns of young people. And having renewable energy in the community, especially in a province with a government that has been so unfavorable towards Indigenous renewable energy development, is also a point of pride for this youth council member in particular. The leadership that the community is showing in the renewable energy sector is acting as kind of a signal for the kind of future that they want to build in the community and that they want to see for their young people. These outcomes are felt locally, and they're also felt outside the community as sort of a promising sign to this growing network of communities and other Indigenous nations who are envisioning a different way forward in this province. And it's a sign that a green energy future can be possible. And I think I'll leave it at that. I'm looking forward to your questions and to some discussion. My thanks and acknowledgement to the community members who have contributing to this project and to my research partners from the community. And thanks, everyone.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Andrea.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I'm talking about climate change in Alberta and whether climate change denial might be creating opposition to wind energy. So first, I'm just going to talk about denial to kind of set the stage and set it as a psychological coping mechanism. Then talk about climate change denial briefly, talk about the research project, which was an online survey sent to 401 rural Albertan farmers. And then talk about my kind of findings just briefly as well, that there's sort of this climate beliefs, have many manifestations, and those start to cluster, and there's a reason for it. So quickly as well, what is denial? As you might know, it is a psychological phenomenon that we all do, and it's where we reject information, even though there's an overwhelming amount of information, evidence that it's true. And we use this process called motivated reasoning, a two-step process that I've illustrated. And we use this process to avoid negative emotions. So we can kind of think of it as ideas come into us. It's unconscious, then they're in us, these deeply held worldview beliefs. And then from there on, it's uncomfortable to get rid of them. So we continue to rationalize them. When we're arguing online, saying we're reasoning with people, we're actually sort of rationalizing our previous thoughts. So then we can take that and apply it to climate denial as well. So climate denial is the application of this emotional coping mechanism to climate change, obviously, and as we all know. And then it has multiple manifestations. So it isn't, sometimes on a survey, we might say, are you concerned about climate change? And then that's our one metric, but there's actually so many different ways it can form. Some might say, oh, it's natural, the earth is supposed to warm, or it won't affect us here. It won't be that severe, it won't be that bad. They might deny that it's happening. They might accept that it's happening, but say, we've got time, it's happening, but it's happening later. So there's so many different ways that denial can unfold. And many people know, there's some sources of denial. I don't want to name names or anything, but you kind of think of all these sort of influences. You can kind of think about all these factors around us and whether we're trying to preserve our group identity, or we're being influenced by oil companies, or we have some human nature, dualistic human view that makes it really hard to see that we might influence nature. Those are all kind of factors as well. But essentially, denial is an outcome of motivated reasoning. And I bring this all up because I think sometimes in talks about climate change, we have this sort of deficit model approach where we think people they just don't know, or we can convince them, or they're stupid because they just don't get it. But if anything about, like living in a pandemic has kind of taught me, it's that we're all kind of coming from different places, and sometimes you just can't reason. And so I think this denial, breakdown, I also mention it because I think it's important just to be aware of it, is that we're all doing this. And so now going to the research project, talking about climate denial in Alberta. And the kind of questions I'm asking in this broader project are, how are Albertan farmers thinking about wind energy? Do they like it? What are their hangups on it? Then what beliefs do they have about climate change as well? We want to see if those beliefs start to form patterns or clusters. And then we see, are those clusters maybe impacting wind opposition, or what aspect of those clusters are? So I'm kind of trying to like get really into climate denial, and just ask, is climate denial shaping wind energy views in rural Alberta? So it was a 20-minute survey that we sent out through an agricultural polling firm. There was 401 respondents. They're all sort of the person who makes decisions on the farm. So it turned out to be a lot of older males, conservative leaning as well. And they all had over 5 acres. So we kind of set that condition. So it's like they could maybe possibly have wind energy on their farm. They're not like little acreages. And they all got $20 compensation. So that kind of helps boost the validity of the answers through reciprocity. So first, getting into kind of the results, just broad overview. When asked people, should there be more wind turbines in Alberta? It was actually, I think, kind of a hopeful response in a way, where 39% said they strongly agreed or agreed, and 35% was no, and we had a big neutral chunk as well. For given the demographic we have, I thought that was actually kind of like a nice thing. Then moving on, looking at, in the survey, they were given these 5 dimensions of climate change. And so those dimensions, I wrote them there, but essentially it's like, how concerned are you? How certain are you about it being real? Do you think it'll affect you? Do you think renewable energy can do anything about it? And are we responsible? Those are kind of the questions, the dimensions that I had picked earlier to put in. And as you can see, kind of looking at this overall blip of the group, it's really, really neutral actually, but erring on the side of, kind of climate denial. What I think is interesting on this graph as well is that local impact is actually way higher than the other ones. And I think a big part of that too is you can maybe deny some really abstract things, but when your material reality changes, becomes harder to deny. So climate change is an abstract statistical phenomena, but if your growing season has expanded by a few weeks, or there's there's more frost-free days, you might start to say, hey, there's actually a local impact and I can't really deny away that anymore. And then looking at this, I want to say, well, you know what, people tend to, and in other studies, they tend to cluster in their beliefs. And so doing a ward cluster analysis, which kind of reduces the variation in between the groups, so that the two groups are as different as they could possibly be. And looking at the dendrogram, there was clearly 2 groups that were present. So there was the blue group, the realists, as I name them. They're much more concerned. They think they're way more likely to think there's a local impact. And they're just erring on the side of like, yeah, renewable energy might do something and Alberta should do something as well. Then you have the skeptics, and they're way farther away. It's like way stronger to the strongly disagree side, except for the local impact is still pretty strong. And I thought that was interesting as well, because it's kind of resilient, this idea that like, if your material circumstances are changing, you cannot just simply deny it away. And this could be due to this sort of concept of 2 different interpretive communities, where we're sort of, our viewpoints are all the things that affect us kind of shape these views that we have. And then we have to use rationalization to continue holding those beliefs. And that can kind of explain why conversations about the pandemic, about many things are hard, because we're coming from different perspectives and those perspectives we gained them unconsciously. So then just kind of on a final note, I'm kind of skipping a lot of things, but this was all leading up to this binomial logistic regression. There's a few other things in here that I won't talk about for time, but if you look on the the top left side, when we plugged in all these different concerns into the model and looked at how they affected wind opposition was the dependent variable, we could see that whether you thought renewables were going to do something actually mattered. And all the other ones weren't there on the model in terms of affecting opposition. And we could also see the climate versus skeptics sort of grouping actually held some significance in the model as well. So this scale, if you use the 5 dimensions as a scale, they had a really strong alpha. So this, in theory, we could be making climate change scales that are kind of hitting on a bunch of dimensions, and then trying to figure out, where did people get to, how did they get to those groups? And we can start looking at these interpretive communities. What are all these social facts influencing these people that lead them to then just naturally have these views? I think it kind of humanizes, wind opposition and even climate deniers, because it's sort of seeing us as all just, we're like unconsciously affected by what's around us. And on an individual level, climate change is a very scary, threatening thing. And denial is a protective mechanism. It's a coping mechanism. It's a very human thing. So I think kind of looking at denial and interpretive communities is just a really helpful way to kind of step back and figure out, why can't we have these productive conversations, and why are people coming from such different perspectives? And the final thing I'll point out on this is that norms were a big influence too. And so norms, social norms, just what people around you, what your community, what your interpretive community is saying, is a big influence on whether you're going to be feeling more like a climate denier or a realist. That's it. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. 2 thumbs up for all the students and their excellent presentations. I'm thrilled to be able to catch up with you guys and learn more about how your projects have gone. So it's such a wonderful forum to do that. And we have other graduate students who have joined us as well, some from your year and some new graduate students. And so, John, did you want to make any remarks before discussion and questions?
Yeah, no remarks really. Just would be happy to open it up to conversation. Thanks to all 3 for good presentations, and I guess we've got another 10 minutes or so for people to talk and discuss specific points or go back to things that people said, and to create some further clarity if needed. So yeah, happy to entertain questions verbally or in the chat. Excellent.
So, John, did you want to manage the questions? You may be able to direct to the students as needed, or I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to manage the questions. Yeah. Anybody want to go first? Henry?
Thanks, John. Thank you to everyone. Really learned a lot. I have a first question to Monique, and maybe this is just the way I understood how you defined it, but is it considered denial if what you believe, even if it is counter to the mainstream, if what you believe is actually in fact correct?
Yeah, totally. I've been thinking about that too. And I don't really totally know in that case. It's actually, I've been stuck on it. It's hard to say. It's almost like denial if you're against everyone else, right? Like, because you're also, the validity of information, how we know it's true, like what is true, right? It's sometimes kind of just what people say around us. We all hold so many beliefs that are not necessarily real. We just say that's what we do. And then that becomes the truth. And then when you deny that, when you resist that, you might be acting out of denial. But I guess the denial part is that you're using this mechanism, which again, it's inside your head. It isn't really totally measurable.
Right.
Yeah.
So related to that then, how much does it matter where we get our information? So just a very simple contrast, Fox News versus CBC. You kind of touched on it, but if I am a consumer of Fox News and everybody I know is a consumer of Fox News, and I agree with everybody I know, I may be in denial with reference to the bigger group that I never communicate with, but it's not really denial to me because everybody that I talk to, everything that I consume tells me that climate change is not real. So I guess both questions relate to how you define denial, and sort of when you use the definition that I think you use, it sort of assumes that one, what is right and wrong, and then two, that we all have access to sort of the same information, but there's one group that is sort of making this mental gymnastics to sort of deal with their cognitive dissonance of what they want to believe versus what is true. Do you sort of see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, totally. Like, I made it like, there's all this information for everyone, and then some people just aren't tapping into it or they're ignoring it. To some degree, we all have access to a lot of information going both ways, and we can kind of get trapped into a stream of information. It's super interesting. I kind of forgot what your general, how do I define it?
Right. So I guess based on your first two slides, I got the impression that denial was very much this mechanism that I use to sort of ward off sort of what I'm hearing from the outside, or to ward off what if I really, truly, deeply thought about it, know to be the truth. But I think that's a little bit presumptuous for a lot of people who simply think that climate change is not a real thing. And that we're the deniers of, natural oscillations in global temperature, for example.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, we're all, some people would say we're all climate deniers. Like Norgard would say that there's maybe some sort of this kind of like techno optimist, like Silicon Valley vibe. We can tech our way out of it. Let's shoot stuff in the atmosphere and fix it. Like that would be denial too, in a way, to someone else who says, actually, we have to address, the global economic system, right? So some would say like, it is really a kind of a subjective thing, and it's a really cultural thing too. And then there's sort of leaving the sort of individual psychological approach. There's sort of this like social construction of climate denial that's like perpetuated and spread. And then like there's people on a Zoom call right now talking about how we're climate deniers, or economy deniers or something, or whatever. It is really subjective. You're right on that.
Thanks, Henry. It sort of got me thinking about a bunch of different things too. So we'll take that up on another conversation. Looks like we've got Brent with the question.
Yeah, thanks, John. I have a question for Andrea, and good job, all three speakers. Really, really clear and interesting presentations. So, Andrea, I'm interested in that very last point you had of the Enoch youth leader and his comments about sort of a demonstration effect to others. And I wonder whether he was meaning demonstration to other First Nations or demonstration to other non-First Nations communities. And, that's one question. And do you think there's any evidence of that kind of positive spillover effects of a positive experience with renewable energies in some places kind of spilling over to neighbors?
Yeah, thanks, Brent. I think she definitely was referring to both First Nations and Métis communities who are pursuing renewables, as well as cities and towns that are surrounding Enoch, Devon, Edmonton. And I think we really are seeing sort of a growing network of First Nations specifically that are developing these projects. And within that network, I think there really is that peer-to-peer learning taking place. And there are formalized networks like this social enterprise called Indigenous Clean Energy that are actually creating opportunities for nations to get together and to share knowledge and to navigate the development process, because it is something to navigate. It's a tricky process oftentimes. And so, yeah, I would say there is evidence of that, that network and that knowledge sharing and that sort of domino effect, which I think is really cool to see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Michael.
I have a question for Sonak. First of all, great presentation from all three of you. I really enjoyed them. I was curious about the regional effects for municipalities and how if they have stronger relationships with their neighboring municipalities, they're more likely to want to do these projects, or how that kind of plays into it.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Michael. Yeah, that's something that did get brought up a lot, is how municipalities do interact with their neighbors. I know in Edmonton, there's a big focus on the EMRB and regional approaches on that end. And a lot of people talked about the importance of entities like the AUMA, the RMA. These are provincial institutions that, do provide that forum for municipalities to interact and engage with each other. And one of the challenges that has often come up is related to this idea of competition between municipalities. If you're, not interested in climate action, why would you go to Edmonton where your property taxes are going towards, say, renewable development, when you could go to an adjacent municipality, probably still commute, and be able to have your property taxes either be lower or go towards things you care about more. So that collaborative approach is definitely something that's important, and I think it's something that has been challenged in Alberta. A lot of people that I've spoken to in Edmonton have talked about how they've leaned on other municipalities globally for inspiration because they feel like they're kind of ahead of the curve on energy transition in Alberta. So I think that's an interesting thing to take a look at over the next couple of years, is the success of Edmonton's energy transition efforts, whether that'll inspire other municipalities. But yeah, it's certainly something that's a consideration. I haven't seen a lot of regional approaches yet, but I think also as a province, we're kind of challenged with regional approaches with the way that our legislation is set up. But be very curious to see how that changes in the near future. I hope that answered your question. Please let me know if something you want to follow up with.
Michael, I was just curious, were you thinking about a clustering effect, like a variable that might actually measure the role that a cluster would play in support for renewables?
Yeah, especially that, and also if the municipalities have some kind of prior arrangement already for other services, say, and then they can add on another one pretty easily compared to neighboring municipalities that might not have any real relationship with each other, and the difficulties overcoming that, I guess.
I was thinking like places like Medicine Hat, where they've got the Box Springs wind turbine. Maybe there's like a contagion effect around Medicine Hat of other communities that are maybe trying to do something similar. But
right, yeah, and in southern Alberta, with a lot of wind farms kind of coming up too, maybe they might be influenced by each other.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Henry.
So this is more of a comment than a question, but this is for Sonak and Monique. It looked like from your regressions, your binary regressions, that most of your variables were sort of variables of interest that you want to know, does this have an effect on my yes, no answer? And so typically when you're testing like a lot of hypotheses sort of simultaneously, you just need to correct the standard errors. You basically need a higher bar for significance, because you can just get just by chance, if you're using a 5% level, 5% of the time it will be a positive, even if it really isn't, right? So, and when you do like 10 of those or 20 of those, your chances of hitting false positives just goes up. So you just got to correct for those. The simplest one is called Bonferroni. It's sometimes considered too conservative. There are other much fancier ones. So if you just look at multiple hypothesis testing correction, that'll give you lots of ways to, it just raises the bar for significance, because when you have so many variables of interest, you're going to get some that are significant just by chance.
Great, thanks, Henry. Appreciate that. Well, what do you think, Brenda? Are we at time? Oh,
I think we're at time unless there are other questions or comments. I'm just looking at the chat. All great comments in the chat. If you have a chance to look at those, please do. I think we'll call it a day. It's 4:03, and people probably have other things at the end of their afternoon that they need to focus on. So I'd like everyone to join me in a round of applause again for the fabulous presentations. Really grateful for the time you spent putting those together. I know you're working on your theses and coming up with a slide deck presentation on top of other things that you're doing. Takes some effort. So thank you to John for coordinating this presentation. Series of presentations. I'd like to highlight that we do have another presentation next week, another brown bag seminar, and I'll be sending out some information about that by tomorrow. And really grateful for everyone who attended. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
thanks, everyone.